Julia Serano is an Oakland, California-based writer, performer, biologist, and activist. She's the author of several books, which we've got some of them up on the screens, including Whipping Girl, a transsexual woman on sexism, and The Scapegoating of Femininity. And her latest book, Sexed Up, How Society Sexualizes Us and How We Can Fight Back. Julia's other writings have appeared in over 20 anthologies and in media outlets such as The New York Times, The Guardian, Time Magazine, Salon, The Daily Beast, Alternet, Out, and Ms. Magazine. Her life experiences as a trans woman and her understanding of biology. Now, do you know she has a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biophysics from Columbia University and spent 17 years as a researcher at UC Berkeley in the fields of genetics and developmental biology. So all of that gives her a unique perspective on gender and sexuality. And her writings have been used as teaching materials in colleges and universities across North America. So her talk this evening, called Balancing Acts and Bottom-Up Approaches to Trans Activism, Julia will be drawing on her 20-plus years being involved in trans activism and on her research and writing on how prejudice works and how to effectively counter it. Julia will share her thoughts on these past developments and how we might work to transcend similar exclusions in the future. So please join me in welcoming Julia Serano.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everybody who helped make this conference happen, and thank you all for being here. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to speak. Lately, when I give talks, I've been opening up with a cheesy joke, which basically is me announcing the fact that I'm transitioning to trans elder. And so it's a gradual transition, right? But like one of the first steps along my journey is that I change my glasses so that I can read my notes before my talks. And I should say, so I'm calling these notes, but actually this is pretty much my talk. It's a new talk, so I'll be reading off the page quite a bit, but I'll still make it engaging. So some of the things I'm talking about, balancing acts and bottom-up activism, which will be explained, are ideas that I introduced in my second book, Excluded: Making Feminist and Queer Movements More Inclusive. And I've given talks about that book before, but it's now 10 years old, and so I've been continuing thinking about these ideas. In my most recent book, Sexed Up, I've kind of extended upon kind of the bottom-up activism part that I'll be explaining. So this is a brand new amalgamation of a bunch of different stuff. So I hope you enjoy. And I figured that because this is a trans history conference, that it would be useful to like start out with a little personal history that I think leads into the topics that I want to talk about. So basically, 20 years ago, as amazing it is for me to think about this, 20 years ago this summer, I attended Camp Trans for the first time. And so, for those of you who don't know what Camp Trans is, it was the annual protest of the Michigan Women's Music Festival's Women Born Women Only policy, which was basically that excluded trans women from attending. And it's important to note that at the time, MishFest was the largest annual women's only event, so this policy was significant, which is why Camp Trans started and was very vital in the years before I got there and part of early trans activism in the 90s, et cetera. So when I went in there, I didn't really think of myself as a trans activist at the time. I more thought of myself as a trans artist, and that I was mostly a musician, and I did poetry slam, but I wasn't really thinking of myself as an activist. But my experiences there at MishFest, and particularly my interactions with some of the attendees of the festival, some of whom were very skeptical about trans people across the board, but others who were actually very welcoming of trans male and trans masculine people attending, but drew the line when it came to trans women, made me start to question kind of some basic presumptions about how anti-trans discrimination works. So at the time, we basically had one catch-all term, which we still have today, which is transphobia, to describe anti-trans sentiment. while it's a useful term for if like we're talking about general animosity or derision towards trans people, the word sort of breaks down a bit when you're talking about kind of discriminating against some trans people but not others. It's also not as suitable as I thought we would like for talking about more subtle double standards that trans people sometimes face, even amongst people who are otherwise like tolerating or accepting of us. So I began writing a series of essays fleshing out these alternative framings, which ultimately grew and evolved into my first book, Whipping Girl, which came out into 2007. So that book was largely centered on two concepts. The first being cissexism, which is the assumption that trans bodies, identities, and life experiences are somehow less authentic or legitimate than cisgender ones. So cissexism is a lot like how we use the word cisnormativity today. And the other one was transmisogyny, which is the notion that femaleness and femininity are inferior to maleness and masculinity informs a lot of the experiences and discrimination faced by trans female and feminine people. So in the 15 years since Whipping Girl's come out, I still sometimes write about cissexism and transmisogyny. But in those years, a lot of my attention has been like turned to adjacent matters that grew out like post that book coming out that I've been thinking about and grappling with. So I'm going to talk about like these two main things. So the first one was I was struck by all the parallels that exist between these phenomena and other forms of marginalization. So as but one example, transness and femininity are both routinely mischaracterized as artificial, irrational, superficial, frivolous, and manipulative relative to their cisgender and masculine counterparts, which are typically seen as sincere, serious in comparison. In Whipping Girl, I made the case that these overlapping stereotypes associated with both transness and femininity help drive transmisogyny, and also the disproportionate attention that the media has historically played to those of us on the trans feminine spectrum because we're easier to sensationalize and to depict as fake. Similarly, there are all sorts of parallels between cissexism and heterosexism. Since the latter concept was familiar to a lot of people when I was first giving talks about Whipping Girl, I would often make comparisons when I was doing talks about the book. I would make direct comparisons between the two. So I would point out, for example, that both heterosexism and cissexism are centered on the assumption that all people must be heterosexual and cisgender by default. This is what creates the ideas that we are in the closet, that we have to come out, and that we pass. Furthermore, when we are known to others, heterosexism and cissexism are what lead people to view us as inherently remarkable. That is, people will comment about the fact that I'm bisexual or transgender in ways that they would never comment about me if I was heterosexual or cisgender. They also lead people to view us as questionable. That is, they may ask, how do you know that you're really bisexual? Or when did you first know that you were transgender? Which are questions that heterosexual and cisgender people never experience. Basically, both heterosexism and cissexism lead people to project ulterior motives onto us. So for example, they might say, you're not bisexual or transgender, you're just confused, or you're looking for an alternative lifestyle, or you're out to sexually deceive other people, and so on. So notably, the parallels that I've just described between heterosexism and cissexism aren't specific to those two, and they actually pop up over and over again with a lot of other forms of marginalization. In fact, marginalized groups are often viewed as remarkable, questionable, irrational, artificial, and manipulative. So I wanted to better understand why these recurring features of marginalization happen. But then second, and this was strange, being that there are all these parallels that were really obvious to me, is that it struck me that despite these parallels, many people seemed reluctant or incapable of recognizing these connections. So for instance, back when I was giving early Whipping Girl talks, and I would draw comparisons between heterosexism and cissexism, a few people would act baffled or sometimes incredulous, sometimes even arguing that heterosexism was a real form of oppression, whereas cissexism was a fake concept that was invented by trans activists. Now, of course, you could make this exact same argument about heterosexism, which was invented by gay activists in the 1970s. Here's an even more pertinent example. So just before Whipping Girl came out, I had a chance to talk at an Association for Women in Psychology conference, which is basically, it's a feminist psychology conference. And I was at the plenary talk, and there's this woman who was giving a talk about how feminism informed her experiences as a therapist. And in the middle of the talk, she talks about two trans clients of hers, one on the trans-masculine spectrum, one on the trans-feminine spectrum, both of whom were considering transitioning. And when she talked about the trans-masculine spectrum client, she was very serious. She referred to the person's gender presentation simply as very butch. And basically, the audience listened very seriously and attentively. And then, out of the blue, when she starts talking about the trans-feminine person, she became like really animated, and she's like, this person walked into my office, and her hair was like this, and she was wearing this, and she had her makeup done like this, and everyone in the audience was giggling, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening at a feminist psychology conference. And it seemed really obvious to me that if we were at a regular psychology conference and a cis man got up and talked about one of his female clients entering the office and her hair was done like this and she was wearing this, people would be like, oh my God, that's so sexist. And I think that they just couldn't see the connections because the person who was being described didn't fit their imagined view of like who is the victim of sexism. So it would have been easy for me to dismiss that all these attendees were trans-misogynists through and through, but I don't believe that was the case. And in fact, later in the day, I gave my talk, and I looked it up because this is a history conference. My talk that day was the psychiatric sexualization of male to female transgenderism. So that's like very old school talk. And, and many of these same audience members came to my talk, so they obviously wanted to hear what a trans woman had to say. And since my talk touched upon trans-misogyny, I decided to use the plenary experience as like, you know, as an example, not in a gotcha sort of way, but in a teachable moment sort of way. And after my talk, many of these people came up to me afterwards, said they liked my talk, and a few of them expressed their embarrassment that they were one of the people who giggled during that session. And in talking to them, they were really sincere about the fact that they didn't pick up on how sexist that comment was. And again, I think this is because that person didn't fit their stereotypical image of who is affected by sexism, well, women, AKA cis women. So to be clear, I still think it's really useful to talk about cis-sexism and trans-misogyny, and sometimes I write about those things. But it seems to me that there was a really foundational problem that was going on here, one that not only contributes to trans exclusion, but also to the exclusion of other marginalized groups from social justice movements. Basically, even those of us who are dedicated activists are often not very good applying what we already know and understand about some forms of marginalization when it comes up with somebody who's a new group, who faces obstacles that seem new to us. So this became the central focus of my second book, Excluded. And in that, I framed this as a matter of top-down versus bottom-up approaches to activism, which I will describe over the next couple slides. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Cancel. See, I'm used to on my Mac, I can hit the down button, and that's sufficient. I just want to cancel that. Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. I have to remember, go right. Swipe right, okay? I don't use the online dating apps, so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I know you swipe different ways though. Okay, swipe right. And so I want to apologize for a lot of my slides have bathroom insignia on them. I just wanted a generic person. And so I'm going with this, but these are not men. They're just basically people of unspecified genders who just so happen to be wearing pants right now. And the different color rays of oppression that are shooting out of them is just supposed to indicate that there are people who are marginalized by some form or forms of marginalization. Okay. So, growing up in our culture, most of us are socialized not to question the many hierarchies and double standards that exist. We're basically just supposed to view them as that's the way things are. And if we do eventually come to consciously view them as injustices or inequities, that's typically through a standard top-down approach. And I say top-down because it usually begins with the understanding that there's some kind of overarching ideology or an ism that is targeting a particular subgroup of people. So for me personally, the first form of marginalization that I learned about in depth, that is in more than just a cursory or superficial sort of way, was sexism. And so I had female friends and I read feminist writers who pointed out to me a series of assumptions and expectations, norms and stereotypes and systemic practices and so on that were rooted in the notion that women are inferior to or less legitimate than men. It included a wide range of things. There were some abstract concepts like the male gaze and universal he. And then there are also specific experiences like sexual harassment or being stereotyped as shallow or overly emotional or being expected to be the primary caregiver and so on. Okay, so it's a whole bunch of stuff. And so for me, it was a gradual process of learning to recognize these patterns. And excluded, I analogized it to recognizing constellations of stars. So back when I was young and I looked up at the sky, I don't really see many stars these days because of light pollution, but back then there was less of that. And I would look up and it was just a mess of stars, right? Just lots of stars. And at one point, somebody taught me the Big Dipper. And they was like, see those stars? They're all connected. And at first I was like, what do you mean? I don't understand. Like, well, why are those stars connected? But they showed me, and then I was like, oh, the Big Dipper. And the thing about that is that once I learned about the Big Dipper, now if I look up at the sky, it just jumps right out at me, right? I completely notice it immediately. Much like now if I'm watching a TV show and there's a sexist comment or trope, it just jumps right out of me because I've learned that constellation. So I'd argue that when we learn about most forms of marginalization, it's in this top-down manner. So for instance, we might also learn about racism. And that is its like whole other form of assumptions, expectations, stereotypes, systemic practices, and so forth. And we come to gradually recognize that, and that's kind of like learning another constellation, like Orion. And as time goes on, we might learn about more forms of marginalization, maybe classism or heterosexism or ableism in some form or other. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. This is important stuff for us to learn and to be aware of. But there's a problem here, which is that, I would say there are a couple problems here. And so, sorry, I lost my place where I was. There are drawbacks to centering on focusing on the specific isms. And so for starters, they're each like starting from scratch, right? They're starting to, you have to start with like learning all these new pieces of a puzzle. And just as there's nothing about Big Dipper that helps me to learn how to see Orion, having a thorough understanding of sexism doesn't necessarily help me to understand these other forms of marginalization. The second thing is that focusing on specific isms often leads to overly simplistic ideas about how marginalization works, often centering on people of a precise identity who are imagined to be canonical or ideal targets of that oppression. So again, this is what I think happened in that plenary session, that it didn't look like sexism to some of those attendees because it didn't seem like it affected the right person. So this isn't also like just a cis versus trans thing. People often discount sexism experienced by women of color or women with disabilities or fat women or sexually minority women because it doesn't look like the types of sexism that they learned. Or even worse, sometimes people will view what's happening to them as like, well, they're a minority that deserves what they get. So furthermore, some forms of marginalization are wielded against members of the dominant group, or the dominant or majority group, as a way to keep them in line, right? So a really obvious thing here that a lot of people in this room will be familiar with is the ways in which feminizing slurs are used to police the behaviors of men or people perceived as men. Or how queer-phobic slurs are often used to police straight people's behaviors. So in other words, the notion that there's some canonical or ideal group member who's the primary or sole target of the ism in question leads to what are so-called border wars. So those are the border wars. And where individuals who face the same or related forms of marginalization jockey to create intra-community hierarchies. And so I've seen a bajillion of these in my many years out in like trans communities, taking lots of different forms. You know, there's like transsexual versus transgender, or transsexual versus crossdressers, or trans women versus drag queens, or trans men versus butch lesbians, right? And these are people who are facing very similar forms of marginalization, but they're kind of jockeying, and they might have different interpretations of what's happening. And invariably, this leads to accusations a lot of times that, like, some people, the oppression that they experience is authentic, and other people's what other people are experiencing is they're just merely reinforcing the oppression of the rest of the group, which is a phrase that you'll hear come up over and over again because it's really pernicious in a lot of activist circles. One final reason why top-down approaches are insufficient is that there are a finite number of isms that any of us can be fully aware of. So return to my analogy, while I can pick the Big Dipper and Orion out of the sky, those are the only two constellations I know. And like maybe you can show me Cassiopeia or Leo, right? But there are only a certain number that you know. And even seasoned astronomers, like they might know most of the constellations, but there are a lot of stars that aren't in constellations. Similarly, there will always be some double standards and hierarchies that remain invisible to us because we never learned about them. So recognizing our shortcomings in this regard is crucial, and it should compel us to be open to seeing new forms of marginalization, even if we haven't heard them articulated before. So instead of focusing solely on a handful of isms, I argue that we should also learn how to see double standards more generally. So in Excluded, I refer to this as the bottom-up approach. And I should say, like from the outset, that this is intended to be, this isn't like we should scrap all the isms and we should just focus on this bottom-up approach. They're intended to be complementary. And so this is an idea, maybe we learn how to see when double standards are happening, how to know when prejudice is happening, and then maybe that's like a red flag that we can be like, oh, actually, maybe something is going on here that I wasn't aware of. Okay. So a crucial starting point for recognizing unconscious biases or mindsets that drive how we view and treat people relative to others, there are a couple different frameworks that we could use here. And Excluded in a chapter called How Double Standards Work, I decided to focus on the framework of markedness, or in my writing I usually call it the unmarked marked binary or mindset. And that isn't an idea I came up with myself. That has existed in different fields. And I'll detail on the next slide. So this is the way I think about this. Human beings were composed of many different traits. So traits could be anything, aspects of our physical bodies, our personalities, our histories, social roles, experiences, behaviors, interests, desires, and so forth. So most of these traits tend to remain unmarked in our culture, meaning that we view them as mundane, unsurprising, and not particularly noteworthy. They seem normal and natural to us, and thus we take them for granted. And I should mention, I don't know how many of you may have seen the panel last night for Framing Agnes, and in the middle of it, Aaron was talking about the privilege of what's called civil inattention, which is the privilege of being able to walk through the world and nobody pays too much attention to what you're doing. And that is definitely like built up. It's definitely a part of this, what I'm calling being unmarked in society. So other people, and specifically like other traits in our culture, are viewed as marked. They strike people as remarkable for some reason or other. And I should also say that what's marked or not marked in different people's eyes, it's very specific. You know, specific people have different histories or who come from different cultures. They might have a different idea of what is marked and what is unmarked. But when you're with a bunch of people who are all in the same culture, a lot of times there are some shared understandings about this. So it's not like traits aren't like essentially marked. It's just that in a lot of people's eyes, they jump out at them. Okay. So again, these marked traits tend to strike people as remarkable, and so we tend to pay them extra attention and scrutiny. Because marked individuals seem striking to us, we may also want to know how they came to be, or why they do the things they do. And this may lead us to question them in both the ask questions and view them as suspect senses of the word. And we may be inclined to attribute underlying causes and interior motives to them. So once again, this is the idea that, oh, you're not really trans, you must be doing it for some other reason. Or the things that I'm doing right now, I must be driven by my transness to do them. I get that all the time online from random people. Okay, in addition to being viewed as conspicuous and questionable, marked traits are also often viewed as unnatural, abnormal, illegitimate, and/or exotic. And so perhaps the best way to think about how marked traits work is as if the marked person, that people view them as having something that the unmarked person does not have. And as a result of this something, it seems to taint every aspect of the marked person. For instance, it could seem to affect their actions or their opinions, right? So my opinions are biased by the fact that I'm trans. Whereas unmarked individuals appear free of any such contamination. Furthermore, this something that marked people supposedly have is also imagined to be sticky, in that all sorts of things can glom onto it. And these things kind of can include assumptions, stereotypes, interrogations, comments, and critiques, which is again why the marked person has the golden rays of oppression shooting out of them. So essentially, the unmarked-marked mindset creates an uneven playing field, where those who are marked will perpetually face undue attention and scrutiny. And so this is why one of the very first things that most marginalized groups do as they start to organize is that they almost always name the unmarked group. Okay, so instead of being normal and natural, we explicitly name the unmarked group as cisgender, or heterosexual, or white, or able-bodied, and so on. This performs a vital function. So instead of there being one group of people who's targeted and singled out for scrutiny, it makes clear that, hey, there are two groups here, right? There's transgender people and cisgender people, and both are legitimate things to be. But the problem is that there is this double standard. There's this ism that leads us to view one group differently and inferiorly to the unmarked group. So when I first started using cis terminology in my book Weapon Girl, and this was when this language was still kind of obscure, the thing that I found was that, and the reason why I did it, I should say, is like I had this moment where I was just like, I need to do this, because I was trying to explain all these double standards. It is really hard to explain double standards if you don't have a word to describe the other group in the double standard, right? And so that's why I did it, but as I began using the term cis, I found that a lot of people hated it. Oh my God, did people hate it? They still hate it. Some people still hate it. And the reason is, like, they felt singled out by it. They're like, what do you mean cis? I'm not cis. And they acted as though I was marking them by calling them that, right? When in actuality, I was trying to decenter an already existing marked-unmarked binary. So while decentering binaries is necessary work if we wish to challenge marginalization, on some occasions, there are some occasions in which activists may attempt to flip the binary in question, such that those who belong to the dominant majority group are now viewed as inherently questionable and suspect. So this maneuver, it tends to have little effect in mainstream settings, right? So if I'm in the mainstream setting and as a trans person, I start pronouncing my views of cisgender people, people are like, we don't take you seriously, I don't care what you think, like, you're just a trans person, right? But these can have a lot of sway in activist settings, and particularly in activist settings where there are some separatist inclinations going on. So for instance, I was talking about my experiences at Camp Trans at Mishfest. Some of the women at Mishfest, and a lot of the ones who were kind of most in favor of trans exclusion were also the ones who tended to have more separatist leanings. These women would accuse trans women of being, for instance, like of expressing male energy, or of having male privilege, or of reinforcing patriarchal stereotypes of women, and so forth. So in other words, all of those things are ways to lump trans women into the men group. And in their mind, men were the suspicious oppressor class. Notably, many of these same women also have problematic attitudes towards bisexual women and sex workers and women who are kinky and people who are in butch femme relationships. And a lot of the language that they historically used to like dismiss that was they would say those people are male identified women. Right, so they're lumping those people into the oppressor class. There's an essay that's shown at the bottom of the slide that has a really long name that I'm not going to read. And it's in my book, Outspoken, but it's also online, so if you Googled it and my name, or if you go to my writing page on my website, you can find it there. In this essay, I discuss how these similar binary flips sometimes play out within trans communities. And specifically, when this happens, gender-diverse people who appear too cisgender in the eyes of others, regardless of their identities, are often deemed inauthentic and their experiences with sexism are discounted. So in that essay, I tried really hard. I strive to both explain why these sorts of binary flips happen, and sometimes they're for completely understandable reasons, right? Like you can understand why any marginalized group would be suspicious of the people in the dominant majority who they've faced marginalization from. But I also wanted to explain why these tendencies tend to be counterproductive, exclusionary, and anti-intersectional, as lumping all cisgender people into the oppressor class ignores the fact that many of them are marginalized in different ways. Okay, so I'm going to take a sip of water. Okay, so I want to make two more points about marked groups before going on. Okay, so first, because assumptions, stereotypes, and critiques tend to stick to people who are marked, marginalized groups are often subjected to a recurring set of bad things that I called invalidations in my book, Excluded. And I've named a number of the more common ones on this slide. So like one of the most common forms of invalidation is the trope of mental incompetence, which can take various different forms. So marginalized groups may be portrayed as irrational or delusional or confused or mentally inferior or ill and or incapable of making decisions about their own desires, bodies, and lives. And the way this plays out for any different marginalized group can be different because all these groups have different histories and that marginalization is institutionalized a different way, but every single marginalized group faces this in some form or another it comes up. A second pervasive form of invalidation is sexualization, which is when we non-consensually reduce a person to their real or imagined sexual attributes to the exclusion of other characteristics. So this isn't finding people attractive. This is like deciding the only thing that's important about you is this sexual attribute that I imagine you to have. So sexualization, it can involve, like feminists generally talk about, women being reduced or treated as though they're mere sexual objects, and that is most certainly one form of marginalization that I talk a lot about in Sexed Up. But there are also other ones, such as being stereotyped as sexually deviant or predatory or hypersexual or desperate or undesirable or exotic or as a fetish object, as a few examples that I talk about in the book. And in the book, I explain why reducing someone to the status of a sexual being tends to have a delegitimizing or degrading effect on people. And that will come up again in a second. Other common invalidating tropes that marginalized groups face a lot, which are also on the slide, are they're often viewed as immoral, unhealthy, ill, anomalous, inauthentic, and or fake. So, sorry, I'm trying to find where I was again. And again, so all these things play out differently from group to group, but they all have the same effect, which is that these invalidations are tried and true ways of delegitimizing people, of knocking them down a peg. And the fact that they tend to stick more to marked groups but not unmarked groups means that they often serve as red flags when marginalization is occurring. So a lot of times if you're in a group of activists and one person gets singled out and people start talking about them as fake, like fake especially, fake comes up all the time. Like that's like the biggest red flag, like ding, 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 ding. Like can we unpack this fakeness thing, right? Okay, so finally, one more thing about marginalized groups. Because they're so heavily scrutinized, they often face certain double binds. So like a no-win situation, no matter what you do. And so here are a couple ones that I talk about in Excluded. And I won't go into them all here, but just as one example that I think also happens in probably every marginalized group is what I call the ashamed, shameless double bind. So if we experience undue scrutiny about some aspect of our person, for instance, my transness, then people might expect me to be embarrassed about that facet and to try to hide or play it down, right? And so this tendency, for obvious reasons, would feel disempowering to me, although sometimes that might provide some safety, right? So I can understand why people choose that. But if I refuse to hide or play it down, if I'm like super duper out as trans, then people will likely misconstrue me as shameless. And the dictionary for shameless, it suggests immodest, unseemly, and insensible to disgrace. So the shameless side of the double bind feels empowering. It's great to be super duper out. I'm so proud to be trans, but it renders me like even more vulnerable to increased scrutiny because in people's minds, I'm advertising that, and people often make the accusation that I must be asking for any unwanted attention I receive. And the shameless comes out of, like, it's basically the virgin whore double bind that feminists have described with regards to women, whether they repress or express their sexuality, and that's just like one facet of it. And the asking for it always comes for whatever group of people are considered shameless. So many intra-community debates will portray one side of these double binds as the appropriate or righteous response, and the other option as contributing to our oppression. But these proclamations ignore the fact that these are the only two options available. And they both have drawbacks. And even if we were to try to forge a third way, such as I'm neutral or ambivalent about being trans, onlookers will almost certainly interpret me as either ashamed or shameless regardless. In other words, the double bind is impervious to our responses, as it exists first and foremost in the minds of those who mark us. And we need to challenge their perceptions if we wish to overcome it. And so I believe that teaching people about the unmarked mindset and these double binds provides one way, one approach towards this end. Okay, so far, I focus on the unmarked marked mindset, but there's another unconscious mindset that also often contributes to marginalization that I've come to call the stigma contamination mindset. So stigma occurs when a marked trait is viewed negatively, so much so that it seems to discredit and spoil an entire person. So not only are stigmas treated as if they contaminate every aspect of a person in question, so once again, their motives, opinions, disposition, trustworthiness, but they can also spread from the stigmatized individual to their close connections. And sociologist Irving Goffman called this courtesy stigma. Other people call it stigma by association. And it is this fear of spreading, which I've tried to express with like little dots of stigma in addition to golden rays of being marked. So basically, this fear of spreading is what leads people to keep their distance from stigmatized individuals and groups, and or to socially exclude or ostracize them entirely. So in my book, Sexed Up, I review a lot of the research carried out in stigma, particularly by Paul Rosen and colleagues, which demonstrate that stigma is closely associated in people's minds with an imagined contagion. And so this is described as a type of magical thinking that leads people to believe that even the briefest encounter with a stigmatized object or person will contaminate a person permanently. That research also shows that stigma and contagion are both closely associated with feelings of disgust. And there's a lot of great research. We don't talk about disgust when we talk about activism and stuff. There's a lot of great research on prejudice and feelings of disgust and how intertwined they are. And how disgust is a real huge barrier to kind of changing people's minds about marginalized groups. So I try to capture some of the dynamics of this on the slide, which depicts someone who's fully accepted, so like a supposedly upstanding member of the dominant majority group, and someone who is fully stigmatized and thus viewed as highly contaminating. And so there are other gradations of this that I'll get to in a second, but for example, for now we'll just talk about these two. So the fact that people are likely to view our stigma as contagious really explains a lot of bizarre yet commonplace reactions to trans and queer people, such as straight people who fear that if they get too close to us, for instance, if they find us attractive or become intimate with us, that it might somehow make them gay or compromise their own gender, right? They're becoming contaminated by us. Notably, there's a long history of people assuming that homosexuality is contagious, much of which is chronicled in this academic paper shown on the left. The main part of the title is Homosexuality as Contagion, it's an academic paper by Nancy Nauer. And these same fears seem to drive recent claims that transgender identities are now being spread amongst children via social contagion. Even though there's no credible evidence for this, and numerous studies worth of counter-evidence showing that this hypothesis is not correct, and those are summed up in the article on the right there by me. It's a recent article, has lots of studies in it. So there's one last observation that I've added to the stigma contamination mindset, which is namely that people who are fully stigmatized are not only viewed as a potential threat, but they're often viewed as a sexual threat. I attempt to explain why this is in my book, Sexed Up, but here's an extremely abbreviated summary of that explanation, okay? So basically in our culture, we're socialized to view sex and stigma as really deeply intertwined, which is why the subject of sex is considered to be dirty and may invoke shame in people. Heteronormative sex is imagined to involve a man who's seen as the corrupting force, and he takes or defiles the woman who is seen as supposedly corrupted in the act. And these connotations persist even when like straight people are having consensual sex, right? The stigma contagion contamination mindset explains why virgins are supposedly innocent and pure, and yet one fleeting sexual experience will somehow permanently spoil them. And of course, if a woman has too much sex or too many partners, people will say that she's been used up or ruined, even though that's not how sex or bodies work. So in short, people unconsciously view sex as a stigma contamination event. Now, because of this, there's a tendency, especially in people who are already apprehensive about sex, social conservatives, to view heavily stigmatized groups as sexually corrupting and thus constituting a sexual threat, particularly to those who are deemed pure and vulnerable. And usually this translates into women and children. But not any women and children. Only those who are part of the dominant majority group who are imagined to be pure and untainted. So the article on the left, it's an article I wrote in 2021, so about 2 years ago, in which I summarize all the studies showing that trans people do not constitute any kind of threat, sexual or otherwise, in public restrooms. And there's a lot of evidence, a lot of papers. The piece also delved into what was then a less frequent accusation that trans people are grooming or sexualizing children. And I had no idea when I was writing this, like how in those 2 years that would exponentially explode as an accusation that we're constantly facing now. So, like the predator myth, the bathroom predator myth, these accusations are baseless, as I point out in the piece. But unfortunately, and this is something that I feel is like really important that I don't think is quite being said, which is why I'm really writing a lot of articles and I talk about it in Sexed Up, is like it doesn't really matter how much evidence we have because this is not about sexual predation or child sexual abuse at all. What these fears are actually about, they're deep-seated fears about the stigma contamination mindset, and that stigmatized out-groups are corrupting supposedly pure and untainted in-groups. Many people have rightly pointed out the unmistakable analogies or parallels between the anti-trans grooming stuff and like Anita Bryant 1977 Save Our Children campaigns, where like homosexuals or child molesters who are recruiting our children. And so, and that's totally valid. That's a really obvious parallel. But other historians have pointed out that actually these kind of anti-trans sexual predators and grooming charges are very similar to campaigns that have been waged against Black and Jewish people in recent decades as well. And in fact, as I talk about in Sexed Up, if you go back to late 19th century, in the late 19th century, there was this theory that was really popular amongst researchers. It was the theory of degeneration, which posited that people of Northern European heritage, who were considered the most evolved by the caliper-wielding scientists who just so happened to be Northern European themselves, that they were at risk of de-evolving, literally de-evolving, if they had sexual dalliances with people of color, people with disabilities, gender and sexual minorities, and basically any group that they viewed as stigmatized in their eyes. Despite this theory being debunked years ago, some people on the far right continue to promote it, which is why you'll hear these you know, real extremists like still talking about degenerates, like that's a real thing. It's crucial that we learn, let me move ahead, to recognize the telltale signs of the stigma contamination mindset, not only because it plays a central role in these mainstream moral panics targeting marginalized groups, such as the anti-trans groomer campaigns, but also they play a huge role in exclusionary practices within marginalized communities. And I won't go into the specifics of this, but in this article about feminists and LGBTQ+ purity politics, I go more in depth about how that plays a role within our communities. But in addition to this, I think it's important, the stigma contamination mindset is important because I think learning about stigma really helps us understand social justice activism better and how we can prevent our activism from being unnecessarily exclusive. So, while social justice activists often have certain tangible goals in mind, so we might be like trying to stop some kind of law or convention, or you might have some material gains that we're striving for. A lot of what we do, whether tacitly or explicitly, involves destigmatization, right? We're trying to move away from the fully stigmatized category and towards more acceptance, if not full acceptance. So in this diagram right here, I tried to divvy up this process of destigmatization into 3 stages of acceptance that exist between fully stigmatized and fully accepted states. And these are admittedly very arbitrary, but I feel like they'll serve an illustrative purpose. So, through activism and shifting popular opinion, fully stigmatized groups may reach the first stage of acceptance, which is toleration. This involves a reassessment of the stigmatized trait so that now, instead of being completely damning, it's viewed as more of a defect, flaw, or an unfortunate fate. While tolerated groups are often looked down upon and pitied for these reasons, they are mostly seen as human beings rather than monsters, or at least the good ones are. They're also allowed to participate in society to some degree, provided that they don't make too many waves. So in order to reach this stage, what do activists do? Well, a lot of what they do is they do appeals to humanity. So during the early to mid 2000s, when there still wasn't a whole lot of trans awareness and I was newly out, I would do a lot of Trans 101 events where I'd get up in front of the audience and I'd be like, hello, my name is Julia, and I'm your transgender person for today. And then I would share like the basics, but I'd also share a lot of personal anecdotes about being trans, and then I'd be like open to any questions you have, right? And a lot of what the goal is, I mean, some of it was to answer questions, but people, you know, they heard those same questions on like Sally Jessy Raphael and Oprah and all those other talk shows, but people kept asking the same questions. But it wasn't really about that. I think it was less about the information, and the goal was more to disarm the audience. It was to make them seem that trans people were not particularly scary, that we weren't like this horrible, stigmatized other. And I didn't realize this then, but I think a lot of that work involved allaying fears of this stigma contamination mindset that I was just talking about. So in a sense, I was showing them that they could be in a room with a transsexual for like an hour and nothing bad would happen to them, right? And I also think, and I write about this in Sexed Up, there's been a lot of debates about born this way, the phrase born this way, and there are a lot of, which was a very, very popular slogan, and a lot of people really don't like it for very understandable reasons, and I appreciate a lot of the critiques for it. But the more I've been thinking about this, I think that people kind of have it all wrong. Like, I don't think born this way was about explaining to other people why we're trans or why we're queer. I think what it was about is just, again, allaying their fears that they'll be contaminated by it. Because if we are born this way, then they can't catch it from us. And I think it's really notable that like this wave of anti-trans and anti-queer activism is really centered on social contagion and groomers, right? Like they're trying to bring back the contagiousness. Okay, so a group that's already tolerated may strive to reach the second level of acceptance, which is legitimization. So rather than being viewed as a defect, the trait is simply a part of human diversity now. And it's just as valid as their unmarked counterparts. So it's at this stage that non-discrimination policies and calls for equal rights will garner some momentum. And this is also the stage when people stop tolerating explicit bigotry against a group. I'm going to skip over something here just for time, but I can get back to it if it comes up later. Okay, another point about this stage of acceptance is even though the marginalized group has become more accepted and their stigma will eventually dissipate to some degree, they'll nevertheless remain marked, right? And so this is why like groups who are marginalized, who are seen as accepted, and they have some status in society, they still often face that undue attention and scrutiny. So that's like a issue that comes up. So the third stage of acceptance is when people acknowledge that biases against groups may be occurring in unconscious and systemic manner. And this often is accompanied by an increased recognition of these more subtle double standards and efforts to transcend them. Since these more subtle double standards are far less obvious than blatant bigotry, people at this stage will be encouraged to listen to and defer to the marginalized group on these matters. And new social norms may develop at this point in time in order to further accommodate or perhaps even celebrate the group in question. So to be clear, these stages are not meant to be discrete, right? Over the course of my day, I will meet people who view trans people as monsters, aka fully stigmatized, or who view us as defective, that is, they tolerate us, or they view us as legitimate, or I may be at a trans history conference where people really want to hear what trans people have to say, right? So people are all over the map, and the fact that people are all over the map makes activism really, really difficult. And so I should say I've been thinking about this a lot, especially because of this anti-trans backlash. I've been thinking about like, well, is this worse than it was when I was like newly out? When I was a trans adult in like the 90s and early zeros, is this worse or is it the same? And I would say back then, I would say it was worse, but it was different. It was more predictable. I knew when I came out as trans to people that there's one of two options. They would either fully stigmatize me, aka reject me, or they would tolerate me. And those were really the only two options that I experienced. I had one person say congratulations when I came out to them as trans, and I honestly did not know what to do with it. Like that's not how people reacted back then. But it is how people react now. And I think what's happening now is that a lot of people are still stuck in that tolerating stage, but there are a lot more people who more fully accept trans people today. And I also think that there aren't more people who are fully stigmatizing us. They're the exact same people who always have. The difference is they have to be louder and more organized now. Not, we call it an anti-trans backlash, but it's not really about us. Like, we are the targets, but it's not about us. It's a reaction to all the cisgender people who have moved on and are now tolerating and accepting us. That's what the backlash is about. Okay, so explaining this, the reason why I want to explain it with regards to activist communities and not being exclusionary is that I've met a lot of activists who become kind of stuck on one thing, right? So I know some activists who are really, really focused on the right side of the spectrum, like pushing people into being at the third stage of acceptance. And anyone who does less than that has failed in their eyes, right? And so they might admonish people for not like knowing all the right words or the new social norms regarding trans people. And I also know some trans activists who are really stuck kind of in the toleration stage, like they think we should still be doing the appeals to humanity and not rocking the boat too much. And I think both those approaches in and of themselves is fine. I think it's fine to meet like the cis majority wherever they are, right? And it's fine to push people a little bit further along the thing. I think where the problem is what's counterproductive is not one thing or the other, but it's when we have a one-size-fits-all philosophy. Okay, that's where it becomes counterproductive because, again, people are all over the map and we should be trying to reach as many people as possible. And when I say we should be trying to reach them, I'm specifically talking about trans activists. I don't think every single trans person is required to like be constantly trying to change every cis person's mind. Okay, so I'm kind of working towards winding down because I want there to be plenty of time for questions and answers. So let's see. I also think the other thing is about pushing people to the third stage of acceptance. I think it's really, really hard because it's really easy to get all trans people to agree that yes, we should be treated like human beings. Like every trans person is going to agree with that, right? But when you get to the third stage of acceptance, like what is the best way for the cisgender majority to support trans people? Like that's really, really difficult stuff. And so I've brought back the tiny little people with the rays of oppression to point out, to stress the fact that trans people are super duper heterogeneous, right? So we may belong to different generations, regions, and cultures, and we may differ in our personal histories or our transgender trajectories, or we may face additional forms of marginalization. And the fact that we're socially situated in different ways like means that we'll inevitably differ in like what's best for our community, right? And I put our community in scare quotes because it's really kind of like we're composed of varied communities. So now this slide depicts trans people in our natural habitat, which is disagreeing with one another. And so the point of this slide is not to argue that, oh, well, trans people disagree, so we should just accept every opinion that any trans person has. Some opinions are more right or wrong than others. Some opinions are kind of nefarious. So I'm not advocating that. What I am saying is that we should learn to accept the fact that some of our disagreements may not have easy answers. Sometimes we just have different perspectives informed by different preferences or histories. And nowhere is this more obvious than in varied reactions to trans-related language, which is why I have these people saying different words that if you can't read it, that's fine. They're just gibberish words, because I didn't want to put real words there because then people would be upset, like that their favorite word, I was like suggesting something about it. And I talk about my book, Outspoken, I talk about the activist language merry-go-round and like how like basically, especially with social media, that the language is constantly always changing, and I can't keep up, and I'm online a lot as a trans person who writes about this, right? And I think what's happening is it's stigma, okay? So like, there are some older trans people who've been around for a while, and they've been using some of these words, and then a new cohort of trans people come in, and those older words are associated with trans people, so they're infected by our stigma. So they come up with pure and untainted words, right? And those pure and untainted words are great and empowering until they've been around for a while and then they get associated with our stigma, right? And then the next cohort comes around and says, no, those words are bad too. So I think that's useful. I'm less invested in any particular word these days and more recognizing these dynamics. I think if we all recognize these dynamics, we could maybe live more with one another's language, even if it's not our language preferences per se. So I guess I'll end with, allies, right? So if trans people can't disagree, right? Like, we talk about being an ally. How do you be a good ally? It's like, well, you should listen to trans people and what trans people have to say about ourselves, which is easy on the, like, be treated as a human being thing, but like what language to use. I had somebody pitch me an idea for a book that they thought I should write, and the book was on, you should really write a book on trans-related language, because I think a lot of people would be really interested to know, like, what are the right words to say and everything. I just looked at them and I was like, that book will be outdated before it comes out. Okay. So anyway, and I think we should be a little respectful of people, not like just any random person, like not the gender critical and MAGA types on social media, but I think with people who are generally trying to be allies, I think we should try to extend patience with them, that they might, if I can't keep up with the words, I think that I can understand why they might not either. And so I think it's important for us to keep that in mind too. And so to conclude, I have this chapter that ends excluded. It's called Bouncing Acts. And part of the reason why it's called Bouncing Acts is because to stress the idea that the top-down approach to activism and the bottom-up one that I shared with you today, that these are complementary things. And if we use them both like together, that we may make some progress. And I hope that I convinced you that that the bottom-up strategy is something that could be useful to add to our toolkit. But also by Bouncing Act, I wanted to refer to the fact that activism itself is often a balancing act, right? Especially if we want to be intersectional, right? So, like, you know, I have my own needs and desires and goals, and we as trans communities do too. And so I want to achieve those, but I also have to take into account like other marginalized groups and other people. And so sometimes we're teachers, sometimes we're listeners. And in that chapter, I talk about a number of things that are ways that are really helpful to try to avoid getting outside of these balancing acts where we're really focused on what we want and we're not concerned about other people. And so one is, I suggest to avoid the infallible activist versus ignorant oppressor, or the righteous activist versus evil oppressor dynamics, which happen over and over and over again. And I understand why they happen, but to be honest, if we do want to convince other people, that's not the best way to go about it, to act as though they're ignorant or evil. A second thing that I talk about that comes up over and over again is direct versus indirect expressions of prejudice. So if somebody says trans people are gross or trans people are groomers, I'm all for it, go for it. Call them transphobic. That's fine. That's transphobic. Like if you're gonna like say something blatant like that, that's direct prejudice. But if people people often do indirect forms of activism, and I alluded to these, like when people at MishFest would say, well, trans women are reinforcing patriarchal stereotypes of women by me wearing a dress right now, right? Or whatever. Like, that's indirect. Like, they're not talking about my actual views. They're not talking about what I've done. They're just making this indirect argument that I'm in the oppressor class. And I think we should really avoid that. That often comes up a lot too, especially I see this a lot online where like privilege just comes up for no apparent reason. Like, you know, it's just like, oh, well, you know, male privilege, you know, you have this kind of privilege. And there are, I think privilege is really important as a way to teach people in the dominant majority class about invisible advantages they have. I think it's really useful. I'm not saying let's get rid of that. What I am saying is that when you just try to shut someone down by saying privilege, like what you're doing is you're lumping them into an oppressor class. And there is some stigma that comes with that if you're in, especially in an activist community where like being oppressive is bad. And finally, just ending with the idea that activist language and concepts, that they're tools, right? They're really important tools, that we really need them. But like tools, like hammers and saws are great, but I can do a lot of harm to a person with a hammer or a saw, right? And so I think we should really think about them as tools, be careful about how we use them. When I have a saw, I'm really careful with it. I don't just like wing it around, and I don't think we should like hurl activist type language at people for no reason, just to kind of knock them down a peg. So those are some of my thoughts, and I'm happy there's plenty of time for some questions, and I'm happy to talk with you more then. So thank you.